Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Oldways webinar, An RD's Guide to Cultural Humility and Heritage Diets. Before we start, a few words. This webinar will be posted on the Oldways website. And if you are looking for CPE credits, we will be sending them out next week. So everything will happen next week. I'm Sarah Bear-Sinnott, President of Oldways, and in this webinar, we're going to introduce you to Oldways Heritage Diet Pyramids, cultural models for healthy eating, reflecting culinary traditions around the world, Mediterranean, Asian, Latin American, and African heritage. We'll also introduce you or reintroduce you to Oldways resources that bring these heritage diets to life, as well as discuss the all-important concepts of cultural humility and cultural competence in working with clients and patients to maximize positive results. We're very fortunate to have 3 experts with us, communicators, nutrition educators, who are also knowledgeable and practiced at cultural humility and cultural competence. Constance Brown-Riggs, Karen Lau, and Sylvia Melendez-Klinger, who I'll introduce you to after my brief introduction. They'll be discussing the primary health disparities faced by African Americans, Asian Americans, and Latin Americans in the US. They'll talking about the heritage diets and the foods that make up these traditional diets and give tips for RDs in working with these populations. So on with the webinar. In case you don't know about Oldways, here are an introduction. We're a food and nutrition nonprofit, and our mission is to inspire people to embrace the healthy and sustainable joys of the old ways of eating. And to do this, we create and share how-to resources and recipes and organize educational programs and events like this webinar. While we're best known for introducing the Mediterranean diet pyramid and the whole grain stamp, we have other cultural models for healthy eating, which you'll hear about today. And we believe that food is the greatest gift of heritage. When you look to heritage, there's so much to discover and rediscover. Diabetes is not a part of heritage, and neither is heart disease. What is heritage is a strong body, extraordinary energy, delicious and healthy foods, and a long, healthy life. And here are the 5 cultural models for healthy eating: Mediterranean, Asian, Latin American, vegetarian, and African heritage. And to create each of these pyramids, we have brought together expert nutrition scientific panels, and in the case of African heritage, also culinary historians. Foods that are most prominent are at the base of these pyramids, ones that we advise to base every meal on these foods. And you'll notice similarities among all these different pyramids, but there are also differences. The similarities are that the eating pattern is the same. It's very much focused on plant foods, fruits and vegetables, whole grains, nuts and seeds, beans and legumes, rice and beans, healthy oils, herbs and spices, and then smaller amounts of fish and seafood, poultry, dairy products, and meat, red meat, and sweets. What is different are the different foods that make up the different diets and the regional cuisines, and our panelists will talk about these foods. So taking a closer look at these pyramids, the Mediterranean diet pyramid was introduced in 1993 at a time when Americans were afraid of fat. So you could imagine introducing olive oil was quite revolutionary. This was the first time that lifestyle attributes like physical activity and moderate consumption of wine were included in dietary guidance. The pyramid was updated in 2008 by a nutrition science panel who the changes they made were making fish and seafood more prominent because the research showed that eating fish and seafood twice a week was health promoting. They added herbs and spices for their health benefits, but also because they gave a regional identity to food. And then they brought all the plant foods together to show the lush variety of these wonderful healthy foods to base every meal on. The Asian diet pyramid was introduced in 1995. You can see that it is very similar to the Mediterranean, once again, different foods. And this was recently updated by a scientific panel. The Latin American diet pyramid was introduced in 1996 at a conference in El Paso and updated in 2005 by a scientific panel. You'll notice that it is bilingual, which you'll hear later is so very important in terms of counseling and dealing with patients. Next, the vegetarian diet pyramid was introduced in 1997. While not a cultural model for healthy eating in itself, cultures around the world are known for vegetarian diets. One interesting thing about this pyramid, it was introduced in 97, and this is the updated version from 2013. If you put your finger over the top part where it says options for vegetarians, it becomes completely vegan. And so you see how much of a vegetarian diet really is vegan. And the most recent pyramid, the African Heritage Diet Pyramid, was introduced in 2011 by a panel of nutrition scientists, public health experts, and, as I said, culinary historians. And what was interesting is the culinary historians told us that that the foods, the greens and the herb spices and traditional sauces were so important that we made them a separate categories to themselves. Once again, very similar pattern, but different foods. And this pyramid reflects the culinary traditions of the African diaspora, being Africa, the Caribbean, parts of South America, and the American South. And then a few words about putting these heritage diets into practice. Oldways has a number of different resources, both on our website and in our store. We call these 101 brochures. They give the basics about each of these heritage diets, including the pyramid and tips of how to put this into practice. We have a number of books. Here are two of them. They're both 4-week menu plans, breakfast, lunch, and dinner for 28 days. The Mediterranean is obviously all Mediterranean, includes shopping lists, nutritionals. The Whole Grains Around the World features all 4 heritage diets. 1 week is Asian, 1 Latin American, 1 Mediterranean, and 1 African heritage, especially featuring the heritage grains of those regions. And then we have created curricula, 6-lesson curriculum to teach these diets, to bring the foods to life, how to cook them, and why they're healthy, and also talking about looking to culture as a health solution, looking to your heritage for health. They all have 6 lessons covering individual foods, but they also cover nutrition and culture. And of course, there's food and cooking. People eat food and not nutrition. While nutrition is important, the food has to be incredibly delicious, which these recipes are. We also created one for children, a children's taste of African heritage. And we had such demand that we created one for Latin American heritage. 6 lessons, it's bilingual, the same sort of philosophy, bringing in culture, nutrition, history, and looking to culture and heritage as a health solution. We'd love to have any of you that are participating on the webinar join us to be a teacher. be in touch with us. Our website is oldwayspt.org. And throughout our history, the foundation of our work for the last 30 years can be summed up in words of Michael Pollan. The more we honor cultural differences in eating, the healthier we will be. And it really means that we all need to work together, respecting and learning about each other's cultures to honor these differences, to be a healthier, happier world. We've heard a lot in the last several months about cultural humility, and that is recognizing that we have biases, our own biases, and to try to figure out how we might address these biases and to make changes. And paired with the recognition of our own limits, it's important more than ever to work towards honoring and understanding history, culture, languages, and traditions, and using cultural models for healthy eating. And I think food is a great place to start making a difference and recognizing cultural competence and humility. We're very lucky today that we have 3 such expert speakers to bring this to you, and perhaps bringing a phrase from Kamala Harris's speech yesterday, we could call them a coalition of conscience. They'll help and advise you about how to incorporate these different cultural models for healthy eating and recognizing cultural humility and cultural competence in your practice as you work to help your clients be healthier and happier. So I'm very pleased to introduce Constance Brown Riggs. And she will share her screen here. While she's doing that, Constance is an award-winning registered dietitian, certified diabetes educator, national spokesperson for the American Dietetic Association, and is author of the Diabetes Guide to Enjoying Foods of the World, the African American Guide to Living Well with Diabetes, and Eating Soulfully and Healthfully with Diabetes. Over the course of her career, she has established herself as an expert on the subject of nutrition, diabetes, and the cultural issues that impact the health and healthcare of people of color. Her work has appeared in books for health professionals and healthcare consumers, and she's been a featured expert in national magazines such as Essence, Heart and Soul, Real Health, Diabetic Cooking. You can check out her work at constancebrownriggs.com. We've had the pleasure of working with her with the African Heritage Diet, and I'm thrilled to have her be a part of this webinar. Constance?
Okay, apologies. I guess everyone can hear me now. Forgot to take myself off mute. So today's objectives are to discuss the African American health disparities that are observed in the United States, also to highlight some of the characteristic foods and food traditions from across the African diaspora, and then to provide tips for RDs to reframe their nutrition education using cultural humility as well as culturally relevant programming. Now, as you can see, on this slide, we're actually looking at the fact that African Americans are living longer, which is a very good thing. The death rate of African Americans has actually declined over the past 25 years or so, actually declined 25% over the recent 17-year period. And primarily, those declines are observed in ages 65 and older. But even with those improvements, new analysis shows that younger African Americans are living with or dying of many disease states, conditions that we typically see in older white Americans. And the differences tend to show up when they're in their 20s, 30s, and 40s. Now, when diseases start early, of course, we know if they're starting earlier, they're going to lead to death earlier. So chronic diseases that we see in African Americans, oftentimes they're silent when they start, and by the time they're diagnosed, they have progressed. And these health differences are often due to economic as well as social conditions. And we know those conditions are more common in African Americans than they are in whites. For example, African American adults are more likely to report that they're unable to see a doctor because of economic situations, because of the cost of actually going in to see a doctor. And this slide actually shows you the 3 disease states that have declined over the past 17-year period. So you can see those disease states as they compare to whites. We look at heart disease as well as rates, rates of cancer that decline, and stroke as well. So while there is some bad news, we are still able to see some good news. Now we know COVID is a conversation that everyone is having at this point in time. And recently, it was, all over the news, the fact that African Americans were suffering at disproportionate rates in terms of COVID and in terms of COVID, actually. And initially, when it was shown on TV and the newscasters, and they were asking, well, why? They couldn't understand why this was happening. And my thought was, of course you understand. It's because of the racial disparities that exist. We know these disease states that are associated with greater death rates as a result of COVID are the same disease states that African Americans suffer from in disproportionate rates. And also, what was observed by the CDC is that the virus found that, the CDC found that 33% of those who have been hospitalized are African American, yet African Americans make up only 13% of the general population. And meanwhile, 45% of those in the hospital for the virus are white and non-Hispanic, even though they make up 60% of the total population. So again, we see that COVID actually put a spotlight, if you will, on the health disparities in the African American population. Now, Sarah mentioned cultural humility. And as she said, when we talk about cultural humility, it does involve that examination of yourself. What biases might you have? But also, when we think of cultural humility, it requires some historical perspective. And if you think in terms of African Americans, historically, they've been deprived of adequate health care. One of the big or greatest moments, if you will, in terms of healthcare has to do with the Tuskegee experiment. And with that Tuskegee experiment, African Americans were left to suffer with syphilis so that the researchers were able to see the course, see what happens over time. So they were not given treatment. They thought they were getting treatment, but they were not getting treatment. And as a result, there is that great mistrust in the healthcare community. It's why one of the reasons we don't see many African Americans, if you compare them to other ethnic groups, they don't participate in research. They're very hesitant, reluctant to do anything that has to do with research. Even many to go to the doctor, they're reluctant to go to the doctor. They don't trust the doctor. They don't believe in the medication that the doctor may provide. And much of that has to do with the Tuskegee experiment and a lot of other prejudice that African Americans felt as they tried to go into various hospitals and clinics and so on. So for cultural humility, we also have to look at the historical context for that particular individual. Now, when we talk about African Americans, excuse me, approximately 40 million people of African descent are actually living in the United States. And some have been here for many generations, others are more recent immigrants coming from Africa, the Caribbean, or other parts of the world. And what and how they eat may differ significantly. So, if they're coming from the Caribbean, what they eat may be very different if they're coming from the South, from the Mid-Atlantic states. And of course, with any migrant group, for those that are migrants, if they have been acculturated, well, then their diet is going to be very different as well. Now, health beliefs have a lot to do also with some of the health disparities that African Americans experience. I mentioned Tuskegee early on in view of that cultural humility, but one of the things I always like to point out to kind of drive that point home is in 1997, President Clinton actually apologized to survivors of the Tuskegee experiment. And when he made that apology, a lot of those survivors, there were 8 at the time, they actually had family members that were there. They had children, they had grandchildren. So again, it just helps to illustrate that point that, this for some may sound like something that happened many moons ago. It still is very new, and for many African Americans, very raw. So one of the reasons that we have those health disparities is that mistrust. And then, of course, low priority. Many may be more concerned with the basic needs of just everyday survival, food and shelter, and not necessarily worried about what can happen 20 years from now. So, when we talk prevention, they're not interested in prevention. They're trying to live every single day now, as opposed to thinking about the future. Of course, susceptibility, African Americans that are living at below or near the poverty line actually have diets that are very low when it comes to fruits and vegetables, and especially fresh produce, dairy, whole grains, and meats. We know that definitely has an impact on their nutritional status. And also spirituality. African Americans tend to be people of faith, and many approach health challenges as a test of that faith. And they have the fatalistic view, basically saying it's all in God's hands, there's nothing I can do, and therefore they just go along. So those are some of the disparities or the reasons for the disparities that we see. The health beliefs have a lot to do with that. And then, of course, we have the soul food diet. And I always say soul food gets a bad rap. And because it's really the preparation method, we know that. It's not necessarily the food items themselves. And when we think of soul food, of course, we're thinking of cooking and eating traditions that basically include things that are fried, that are deep fried, heavily laden with fat and oil, also loaded with sugar and salt, and of course, extra calories. So these, the soul food diet may have something to do with the health disparities, but it certainly isn't the only thing that impacts the health disparities. Okay, and many people think of the soul food diet as being the traditional diet of African Americans, but we can look, the soul food diet is really not the traditional diet for African Americans. If we think back in terms of, let's say, transatlantic trade, slave movement, that's African Americans were brought to the South, okay? And so their cooking actually is more reflective of having more fresh fruits, vegetables, grains. They had beautiful gardens filled with cabbage and all of those leafy greens that you saw in the African Heritage Pyramid that Sarah showed. And so the diet was really more of a plant-based diet, a very healthy diet. But what happened, if you will, with the Great Migration, actually is where we see that they had that nice healthy diet, but as they migrated from rural South to large cities in the North and West, it actually changed their eating habits. So they were able to experience, unfortunately, more sweet things. They had a little more money, so they were able to purchase different foods. They had more refined grains. They were eating more fried foods, sweet things that typically were reserved for celebration. So they, on occasion, they would have cake. On occasion, they would have more elaborate meals. But for the most part, their meals were very healthy until the Great Migration. And that's when we start to see more illness, and this is when their diets changed as well. Now, there is scientific evidence that also, if we look at traditional eating habits, that as people move away from their traditional eating and adapt more of a Western way of eating, this is when we see chronic diseases. And a study in the 2010 volume of the Journal of Biomedical Science found, excuse me, that the prevalence of metabolic syndrome in young Tanzanian men increased as they ate more of a non-traditional diet. And they also found the same trend in Botswana as well. And more evidence of metabolic syndrome. And as younger populations shift from traditional to non-traditional lifestyles, this is also where we see more of problems with obesity, high blood pressure, cholesterol. And those that, if we look at the elderly in those same populations, they don't experience the same problems that the younger generation does, because they're maintaining the cultural, we'll say their heritage diet. They're not changing the way that they're eating. It always, when I look at this, it always reminds me of, I went on a medical mission to St. Martin and the Grenadines. And when I got there, the first thing I saw was McDonald's. I couldn't believe it. They have all this beautiful, lush land, and everybody wanted to go to McDonald's, because unfortunately that was a sign of making it, so to speak. But again, the goal is to get them to go back to their old way of eating and not to succumb to the Western diet, and where they would have more illness. Now here, this is just another little illustration of how moving away from the traditional diet can impact one's health. And this particular study is looking at colorectal cancer. And excuse me, what the researchers did is they actually performed a 2-week food exchange, including subjects from the same populations where African Americans were fed 55 grams of a high fiber diet, 16 grams of fat, and the rural Africans were fed a Western style diet, which had 12 grams of was a low fiber diet of 12 grams and 52% fat. So the typical Western diet. And what they found is the African Americans experienced a reduction, excuse me, in inflammation of their colons, improved markers for cancer, and an increased diversity of their healthy gut bacteria. And on the other hand, the rural Africans who ate a Western style diet produced more bile acid, which is a risk for colon cancer. So this just illustrates how a diet, that traditional African diet, is much more healthy than our current Western diet. And it leads you to, as we look at how you can help African Americans reclaim their traditions, is basically the fact that we know that the Western diet is not healthy. So stands to reason we should help and encourage African Americans to reclaim their cultural heritage. Now, I put this slide here. I would really encourage you to read this article. I don't have time to go into it, but the whole premise of the article is that many dietitians are, as it says, creating an unattainable picture of health for their patients. Oftentimes, when African American patients will see a dietitian, they will tell them, for an example, to have hummus. Okay, for dietitians, generally hummus, of course, is something that's really quite common, but for many African Americans, it is not. And they look at that as being, they frame it as white people's food. You may talk to them about acai bowls and that type of thing. And those really aren't typical for many African Americans. So again, the whole premise of the article is to really think about what you're saying, what you're offering to individuals. And I would also encourage you to, when you speak to African Americans, to ask them, if I tell you to eat healthy, what does that mean to you? Because oftentimes when they hear those words, eating healthy, they only think of it in terms of white people's food. Even simple vegetables. When I think of growing up, we never had asparagus, we never had broccoli, we never had Brussels sprouts. Those foods weren't part of our meal plan. It was only when I started actually working in the hospital that I became more acquainted with all of these different foods. So you may assume those are regular vegetables. It really is important to make sure that you're asking that question. Okay, this is one of my favorite slides. It actually just gives you the difference between equity, equality and equity. And we know, as you can see from the slide, when we're talking about equity, we're talking about helping that individual so that everyone is able to see the baseball game, if you will. Okay, I think I'm running over on time. Oops. All right, so we know that when we talk about nutrition, one size does not meet all. And it really, Sarah already went over the African Heritage Pyramid. And the whole point is that when you are developing educational tools, you want those educational tools to represent the group that you are speaking to. Now, this, if you don't have the African Heritage Pyramid, you can make your own pyramid. This is, as I say, do it yourself. This happens to be a soul food, diabetes soul food pyramid that I developed. And it's simply taking traditional foods from the South, throwing them into the pyramid based on their carbohydrate content. And it's something that resonates. So I have both pyramids available. I can offer the African Heritage Pyramid for individuals without diabetes. For those with diabetes, we may look at the diabetes soul food pyramid. And these are just resources that you can find out more in terms of African American health. Each dietetic practice, not each dietetic practice group, part of the dietetic practice group, the DDPG, we have the cultural food practice book, and that will also help as far as diabetes goes. For AADE or ADSES as it's called now, they have the diversity community of interest, and that also is another great resource. It's important to get to know the foods that individuals are eating, and that's what's represented here. I'm happy if anyone has questions about any of these foods after. I'm happy to, you can send me an email and I can answer any questions that you have there. Also really important in terms of looking at the tools, as I mentioned, recognizing the barriers. Lactose intolerance happens to be one for many African Americans. Most of it is lactose maldigestion, but that is something, again, that is kind of passed down. Many have never been tested, but because the mother or the grandmother says you're lactose intolerant, they don't serve milk or they don't have any of those dairy products. So this is something you need to be aware of as well. And to think of your patient's daily experiences, you know, income level, the neighborhood they live in. Are they going to the dollar store to get their food, or, you know, do they have transportation? All of this makes a difference in what we recommend for those individuals. And then, of course, accentuating the positive. I always think in terms of accentuating the positive as opposed to the negative. If you just ask them what you're eating in general, we want more meatless meals. Generally, there are meatless meals that they're eating all the time. They may not think of it as a meatless meal, as a plant-based meal. So we want to accentuate what they're currently eating in terms of plant-based. And then, of course, establish trust, and you do that by coming in terms of cultural humility, understanding what that is. That will enable you to establish trust and show your concern for the individual. And as I mentioned, education materials depicting African Americans, so important to think about what you're giving them as opposed to just a generic handout that doesn't resonate with them at all. Okay, and as I mentioned, recognizing the strength, finding out, are there farmers markets in inner cities? I know in New York, they have green carts because in the New York, Manhattan area and so on, Brooklyn, they don't necessarily have local stores. They're not close to larger grocery stores. They only have bodegas and so on. So they have the green carts, which actually brings in fresh produce to that particular neighborhood. So we want to find out where they can get these fresh fruits and vegetables from. And then, of course, we always recommend Oldways Taste of Heritage cooking curriculum that's available. If another way for you to get continuing education credit, if you haven't already experienced the course, and also learn to become a teacher of that course. Right, so most important to remember is that adapting a westernized diet, of course, we know increases susceptibility to health problems. With cultural humility, it requires historical awareness, and it is so important to reframe our nutrition education programming. In doing that, it can play a key role in bridging the health equity gap in African Americans. So thank you very much for your attention. And as I said, please contact me if you have any questions at all. I'm happy to answer those via email. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Constance. Full of fabulous information. I don't quite know where to start. It was really very, very helpful. I like the equity and equality. It's an important concept. And for all of you listening, we will have time for questions afterwards, I hope. I know that there are 3 right now, and I hope we'll get to them. Constance, we have 3 questions for you that we'll ask at the end. And now I'm pleased to introduce Karen Lau, and she will share her screen now. Karen is a dietitian and diabetes educator at the Asian American Diabetes Initiative of the Joslin Diabetes Center. Originally from Hong Kong, she understands the cultural differences in Asia and the United States. She creates educational materials and provides nutrition recommendations to the patients in the Asian clinic that can be easily adapted to their culture. She's passionate about helping Asian Americans to integrate healthy and enjoyable meals into their daily meal plans for better health. She's also involved in research to find better ways in helping Asian Americans in preventing and managing diabetes. In addition, she shares her experiences in providing care for Asians and Asian Americans with other healthcare professionals from around the world. And she was one of the experts who helped us update the Asian diet pyramid. So welcome. It's wonderful to have you, Karen. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. This is my pleasure to be here today to share with you about how Asian Americans do with their health and how they eat, and hopefully I can also share with you some of the tips that might be helpful for you in providing care for Asian Americans. So to start off, who are Asian Americans? Since year 2000, Asian Americans have become one of the fastest growing populations in the United States. And of Asian Americans, we have a very diverse origin, very diverse background. So here in this chart, you can see that the top 3 groups are Chinese, Indian, and Filipino. So just by the first top 3 group of Asian Americans, it already represents East Asia, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. So we are from very different and diverse background, not only from the origin, but in terms of whether they're immigrants or they were born here in the States. On average, about 60% of Asian Americans were immigrants. They're first generations in the United States. And the certain groups are particularly high as over 90%. And for example, for Japanese, they are the lowest group who are immigrants to this country. They're not even 30% of them. And diversity also spans in terms of how much they make in their household. So as a whole, Asian Americans' household income is higher than United States Americans at that time. So it's about 73K compared to average American household at the same time period is about like 50 to 60K. But you can see that in here that this is actually a very diverse from about like 30K to 100K of different Asian Americans background. And so as the attainment of bachelor degrees. So on average, about 50% of Asian Americans had high degrees, but again, some as low as less than 10% and some as over 70% of them have bachelor degrees. So one word to describe Asian Americans, if in the end, like if after this slides, to remember is that Asian Americans is a very diverse group. So now look into their health. In general, for Asian Americans as a whole, we have a lower BMI. So here you can see that our average BMI is, as a whole, Asian Americans is less than 25, which is the usual cutoff for overweight. But South Asians, you can see that they have a slightly higher BMI. And similarly, for the BMI category that the most Asians falls into is under 23. Again, South Asians slightly heavier. They have more within the BMI category of 25 to 30. But overall, if we're looking for BMI under 25, which is the typical cutoff for overweight, nearly half to over half of them is within this group, which compares to other ethnic groups in the United States is much higher. And so as the other way around, when we look at the obesity rate of BMI over 30, certain groups, so particularly the East Asians and the Southeast Asians, we have less people with BMI over 30, less than 10% of them, which is much lower, even compared to with including South Asians, we have much lower rates of obesity. Overweight and obesity often is the link to chronic disease. So naturally you would think that, oh, Asian Americans are slimmer with lower BMI, then a lot of the chronic disease may be lower, such as diabetes. So now let's look at the diabetes rate. So this actually is not the case. if we look at the diabetes rate across different wage categories, Asian Americans always have much higher rate of diabetes, even within the quote unquote the normal weight group. So that's why we realized for Asian Americans, if we use a 25 as a cutoff to find diabetes, it might not be very helpful. Probably a lot of them will miss. So since 2015, the American Diabetes Association, the ADA, has changed the guideline to start screening Asian Americans with diabetes with a lower BMI, which is BMI 23. So this is still the healthy weight for a lot of people, but they are already at risk for diabetes. And oftentimes they do not know that, and their providers may not be aware that, oh, their BMI is 24. The providers may think that they're still within healthy range, so their BMI is probably good for their diabetes risk. But so that might lead to another disparity among Asian Americans, is a very high undiagnosed rate of diabetes and prediabetes, which is the highest among all racial and ethnic groups. So in this diagram, you can see that the right arrow here is Asian Americans. About 1 in 2 Asian Americans have blood glucose that are higher than the healthy range. So falling into prediabetes or diabetes range, which is higher than non-Hispanic whites. And compared to different ethnic groups, we have a much higher percentage of people who did not realize that their blood sugar is high. So only 1 in 4 realize that they have prediabetes, and only 1 in 3 realize that they have diabetes, which is very high. And now look at other diabetes complications among Asian Americans. We can see that for Asian Americans, they are disproportionately having a high rate of kidney disease. So this data is very interesting. They look at even people with insurance coverage. So sometimes we think that, oh, some of the disparities or the complications are because they lack healthcare. So that's why they have high risk. But this one, we're looking at cases that they are covered for their care. They are still at a higher rate of kidney disease. And earlier on, I mentioned that Asian Americans is a very diverse group. So not only from their heritage, but also in terms of the health point of view. So this chart shows you that South Asians, which is highlighted in this red arrow, have a high rate for cardiovascular disease, which is higher than non-Hispanic whites, as well as other Asian ethnic groups. So within Asian Americans, we have a high rate of diabetes, and overall we have a high rate for kidney disease, but there are also some heterogeneity within it. So South Asians have a high risk for heart disease. And again, diversity probably is really a big word for Asian Americans within that group. We're very different in terms of our background. So our food culture naturally would be very different. So slightly oversimplifying here, I'm grouping Chinese, Korean, and Japanese as a representation of some of the more popular East Asian food culture that you may be aware. So you can see that around the table, everyone has their own bowl of rice, and then there are some shared dishes within the family at the table. And then for Southeast Asians, Vietnamese, for example, they again will have their own bowl of rice or their noodles, and then some dishes shared among themselves. And interestingly, Burmese, which is another South Asian countries, which I learned over the years when I see my patients, oftentimes we would think that Asian Americans, when they eat their food, they use bowls, but Burmese actually they use plates. So as Indian culture, they use plates mostly instead of bowls, and so that's how they usually eat. And you can see that for Burmese, once again, they have their own dish of rice, and then there's some foods shared, and for Indians, most of them have their own sets of foods within among them. So you might see that like a lot of these photos, they have rice as the main staple, but within each culture, the food is also very diverse. For example, for Chinese culture, Southern Chinese people often have rice as their main staple, but then for Northern Chinese people, they might choose bread or other wheat products such as noodles as the main staples. So it's very diverse. But one thing in common you might even find here in this photo is that they are very family oriented. So Asian Americans is a very, very family oriented culture. So it might affect how they eat, because you can see that they share foods with other family members. So they have to be conscious about when they're changing their eating habits, they need to eat healthier. they have also to accommodate the family members as well. So they can't just change for themselves, say, for example, eat brown rice. They can't just have one bowl of brown rice for themselves, but they have to care about other family members, which is very important for us to know when we provide care, as we may not be just targeting that patient, but the entire family, which is a good thing. We can affect the whole family at the same time. And not just the culture itself, but even each type of food is very diverse. So when we talk about rice, bread, and desserts, think of an image that pop up in your mind first thing. So let me share with you what would it be like for different Asians from different backgrounds when they talk about rice. For Japanese, the rice is usually medium grain, and for Chinese is Japanese is usually short grains. Chinese rice are usually medium grain. And then the Indians, when they talk about the rice, is usually long grain basmati rice. And then for bread, depending whether they are more acculturated to the American eating habit or not. So they might be eating like the slices of bread like what we are more used to. Or for some people from southern China, their bread means that it's something inside it, like some meat or some sweet things in it or on top of the bread. And the northern Chinese people might just mean that it's a bun with just wheat. And for Indians, their bread might mean is a naan or chapati, which is usually a short bread, like that. And then finally for desserts, for Chinese culture, they might just mean fruits as desserts or some kind of sweet soups. And interestingly, these sweet soups for Chinese culture, they might have medicinal use. So they might not just be thinking that, oh, I'm having desserts, but I'm having this food to help me in my health. So this is part of their medicinal practices. And then for Indians, some of their sweet foods or desserts are fried doughs, and they might not just be eating it at the end of a meal. They might be eating it as a snack as well. So just talking about one type of food, it can mean very different things across the culture. But like when we look at the macronutrients, even though our types of food are very different, like Sarah mentioned, like in the end, the compositions, the type of foods are it's pretty much similar. Very traditionally, when we're talking about before industrializations, South Asians or East Asians or even Southeast Asians, they are usually more carb-based. And they are usually non-processed carbs, so they're whole grains, and they have usually used less fats and less animal protein, which is pretty much like the pyramid that you just saw in the beginning when Sarah was introducing. And compared to US, which we have a little bit less carb, and generally what we're eating is probably lower in fiber and higher in fats. So now, that was how we used to eat very traditionally before industrializations. How about today? So if there's three answers that you can choose, one is today we're still following a very traditional Asian diet, or now we're pretty much completely Western diet, or somewhere in between. Which answer would you pick? I wish we could see, your face and you can see you raising your hands, but keep that answer in your mind. I'm going to tell you what is the actual facts today. So this is a data from China. So they looked at how they are eating today. The carb, protein, and fat distribution actually resembles more to Western diet. You can see that the amount of fat has increased significantly over the years. And as for fiber, if we do the calculation here, is about 5 grams per 1,000 calories, so which resembles the Western diet. So they might be still choosing more the type of the food ingredients represents the traditional eating habit, but in terms of the preparation, cooking method, already resembles more Western diet. Then how can we provide care for them? I agree with what Connie was saying. Each culture we can go back to how they used to eat more healthily. And even for our guidelines today, particularly for people with diabetes, and for everyone, there's no one size fit all. There's no particular percentage that we need to follow. We don't have to follow a low carb diet in order to help them to eat healthy. In the end of the day, really is the type of foods to make them healthier. So more vegetables, more whole grains, less refined products. And that also is going back to the fact that we have to respect their individual culture and preferences. And that's how we can provide better care for them to follow a better meal plan. Always tell my patients when they ask, oh, what's the best thing to eat? I will tell them that, it's not how perfect the meal plan looks like, but it's something that they can stick to and they enjoy, they can follow throughout their lives, that is the best meal plan that they can have. And of course, healthy. And when we're providing the care, one thing I also want you to remember when we talk about culture, it's not just about ethnic or racial culture. Of course, it contributes a lot of it, but it also looks at like where they're from. Like, are they first generation, second generations, and other many factors might affect it. So it's very, very broad. So some tips that might help you when you provide care for Asian American background people is that ask questions, ask open-ended questions, listen more, and ask about their lifestyle, their food preferences, and their eating habit, which includes whether they're eating with a family, whether they're living with their family or not, and also whether they have a support system. If they're living with a family and the grandchildren, that does affect how you may counsel them. As I mentioned, because we are very family-based, oftentimes they will not agree to change the way of eating just because, like, I don't want to bother my family. I don't want them to follow this way of eating because, they're healthy. So I don't want to change because they don't want to change, or something like that. And also ask about their financial situation as well as their work schedule. As I mentioned earlier, because we have such a broad socioeconomic status among Asian Americans, we really don't know where they're at and whether they have struggles or not. So we have to ask them. And of course, the way of cooking, that also affects how they do. And when asking about cooking method or the foods they eat, sometimes I would also recommend is ask deeper about the dish that they make, what ingredients do they use? And that might help you to understand better, because sometimes they use certain foods, they think, oh, it's no big deal, but they might have more carbs, for example, in those foods. And also when we try to help them to go back to their original traditional way of eating, we can help them by providing some recommendations such as help them to eat more mindfully. And since all those traditional way of eating is whole grains and also vegetables, we can help them to switch to have more vegetables, to make vegetables as the main dish, as the star of the dish. And also introduce more the legumes back to their traditional way of eating, and switching out more processed food. And you might have heard of the plate method, which we use often to help people know how to proportion their foods. Maybe half a plate is vegetables, and a quarter is carb, and quarter is protein. As we see, a lot of us may not, or a lot of the Asian Americans may not be using the plate to eat, so they might not resemble as much. So you can try to use a bowl method, which I call it. For example, you can say, oh, you can have one bowl of rice, and then, or some other kinds of starches, or like they prefer, and then have 2 bowls of vegetables, so they understand the ratio. Or simply you can use the hands, like for example, a fist of rice to 2 fists of vegetables, something like that, that they can simply follow. And also to remember that they might change the way of eating on certain days due to certain life period or certain festivals or cultural events. For example, some Buddhists, they might eat vegetarian dishes on the 1st and the 15th day of the lunar calendar. And on certain festivals like their own New Year, such as Diwali or the Lunar New Year, they might eat different foods. And throughout the life period, for example, for Chinese people, after the pregnancy, they have certain traditional way of eating. It will be pretty hard to change those ways because that's ingrained in them, but we can also help them to understand how we can respect the tradition while introduce something that are healthier. And also finally is traditional medicine. They might not realize that they are using those foods because they just thought that, oh, just one of a dish. And, but they actually might have some effects. For example, pumpkin is a very good example among Chinese culture. So pumpkin, they thought that is actually able to help them to lower their blood sugar because diabetes is a hot disease and pumpkin is a quote unquote cold food in their culture. So they thought that, oh, it's just pumpkin. I don't need to tell my dietitian because it's healthy food. They would say yes. But if you know very well, like pumpkin is very high in carb. So we have to ask really clearly about what type of food so that we can help them better to make changes. So to modify it and to balance it out. Not that they can have it, just probably balance it out. So, so how can we keep the food culture healthily? We see that a lot of times Asian Americans might have switched from the very healthy way of traditional Asian eating so a modernized way of Asian eating. We can help them by introducing all these whole grains, wholesome foods, and vegetables, and help them to bring back to their culture and respect their culture and bring them back to a healthier way of eating. So if you're interested, these are some of the materials that you can find online or from books. Oldways have really good websites. Our center, Jocelyn, has good websites, and of course our academy has very good resources as well that can be helpful. And finally, I just want to leave this line with you. In this way to cultural humility and heritage diets, it's very important for us to be aware, be humble, and to have an open mind to know where people are at, what they eat. And knowledge is only the first step, but how we interact with them, and that mindset of being humble is very important to achieve that. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Karen. It was fascinating, really, really interesting. And now I'm pleased to introduce Sylvia Melendez-Klinger, an award-winning author and global nutrition entrepreneur. She's founder of Hispanic Food Communications, a nutrition communications and culinary consulting company. Her Hispanic background has fueled her passion for nutrition, which has led her to empower and encourage those in her community through the foods they make in their kitchens. Sylvia is often called upon for media interviews. She writes for magazines, blogs, and her most recent publication is the Little Book of Simple Eating in both English and Spanish. Welcome, Sylvia, and thank you so much for joining us and bringing us information about the Latin American diet and population.
Thank you, Sarah. This is wonderful. I cannot be any more excited to share about my experience in the Latin world. I'm going to go as fast as I can because I know that we are short of time, but these are my disclosures. I want to make sure that you know that I have no conflict of interest with this presentation. Wanted to let you know that the Latino, of course, like many other cultures too, is composed of many family members, not just our immediate family. And this is my family. We have my mom living with us now for a number of years. So, but again, everybody's welcome to my home at any single time. The Latino household is reigned by the mother. She's the one who is a caretaker. And also I wanted to let you know that we love to cook. This is something that is not a chore for us, but something that we embrace. And I just want to highlight that we love to go into the grocery stores and we do our purchases according to what people in our household want and what they desire, and they ask us to get, not necessarily thinking about nutrition many times. But when we think about food for us, it's about the love, the bonding with our families. And we are very interested about cooking healthier, but however, when because this is our source of our pride, there is a lot of challenges in between. Our families, of course, we worry about our health of our families. So we focus on wellness and prevention more than anything. In the Latino diet, healthy beans, fruits, vegetables, herbs and spices, many wonderful things. But again, like other diets too, when we move to the United States, then we tend to also assimilate to this culture and not only keep ours, but also add upon, which I think is very interesting when I do a lot of diet analysis. Let's say like Thanksgiving, they'll have all the regular meals, but they also have the traditional Hispanic foods. And, we're not only eating all the traditional Thanksgiving meal, but we're also adding the moles and the, our enchiladas, anything else that we can possibly add that we know the family likes. And that's one of the things that is a challenge for the perception of weight, that we think that having a little meat in your bones is kind of sexy. So where you have to find out where is that line in there, the acceptance of large portions, and not necessarily knowing a lot about the nutritional value of the foods. Celebration is all about the food, and the portions are large, the cacerolas are large, everything is large. And also, as we know, the longer we spend here, also could become an issue. But we know that our diet is influenced by those grains, the beans, and the fresh fruits, but also differs by origin, by countries, also the same way that is for the Asian population as well. So I just want to go very quickly about some of these hero foods, because I think it's not, I just highlighting a few of them. I know there's many of them that are also, and they are highly nutritious. They provide a lot of variety, and they're often low in fat and calories, like, you know, the grains, beans, fruits, vegetables, nuts, and seeds that we're going to emphasize. So the fruits, these are the fruits that, you know, we love to eat, and we can have them every day. So I try to encourage them to have a variety of them and enjoy these fruits that are, you know, highly nutritious and that we have learned to love them. We're like passion fruits that is used in a lot of beverages. The guavas, you know, they're so high in fiber. The mangoes that we also enjoy here, as you know, they're also high in vitamin A and fiber as well. And the avocados, you know, they have many also nutrients aside from the healthy fats. They also have lutein and many other, great properties as well. Same with the vegetables. You know, a lot of these vegetables like jicama, for example. Oh, I love jicamas. You know, that's something that I tend to tell people to eat as snacks with a little bit of lemon juice and a little bit of chili powder. It becomes a really wonderful snack. The peppers, the sweet potatoes, tomatillo, the yuca, very high in fiber as well. So some of these vegetables that we love are actually, you know, very low in calories and fat, sugar, salt, and all of those. The grains, also love, you know, corn, of course, it's something that is in a lot among the Mexicans and in South America. Quinoa also in South America. And we know that a lot of the, you know, the rice and other grains are also very popular among Latinos. Beans, of course, number one, aside from rice and beans, this is, you know, pretty much what most Latinos eat, but they all eat them in different forms and shapes, and different beans for different regions of different countries. So these are some of the ones that are the most popular. And I want to spend a little more time talking about the flavors because I think this is really the essence of our food. And I think this could apply even to other cultures as well. The best that, you know, I think when I do my cooking classes, I try to emphasize that flavoring is the key. And when we add flavor, then we can really slow down the salt and the fat and the sugar in our foods. And flavoring, for example, this smoked paprika, I could never be out without this seasoning. And I have seen it not only, you know, in all our, also in Europe as well, but in Spain. And it's a seasoning that really adds a lot of robust flavor. So finding spices, you know, that really get to the meat of the issue here. But also, you know, enjoying also others, like experimenting with more thyme and things like sage and turmeric and things that we might not be as familiar, but it's always fun to experiment with them. And I like, you know, like with water, trying a little bit of mint or basil or rosemary into a drink, into a water will add a lot of flavor. Onions and garlic, cilantro, chili. This is the essence of our food. And if we can increase that in our cooking, I think we're really on a win-win situation. Same when it comes to desserts, even, you know, with cinnamon, with spicing them with vanilla, ginger, citrus juices is one thing that we love, especially the Mexican population. And I think every region, every country in the Latin world loves citrus juices. So I love to infuse that into the cooking as well. And the zest of that, and of course, coconut, we know that this is a keen in, especially the Caribbean and the coastal regions of some of these countries, where coconut also is a flavor that we enjoy. So I try to incorporate that in a lot of the things that we cooked. But we know that the flavors, you know, different from country to country. So some like it more spicy than others, like Mexicans, of course, like the more spicy. There's hundreds of varieties of chilies that are used in different cooking dishes, and we know that the Caribbean then tend to do more with the adobos, and which is more cilantro and onions, garlic, and things like that. So it differs a little bit. So we have to understand these populations to really cater to the flavors in the spices that they're looking for, so we can increase that and make it a little more robust. Here's some of the sauces that I always incorporate into, you know, in some of the cooking classes, and really to make this the center of what we make in our plates. The top is the sofrito that they love by the Caribbeans, but the Cubans make it with a little bit of tomato. Then we have the chimichurri. Oh, I love that. It's with garlic, olive oil, lots of parsley, and a few other. I can send you some of these recipes with no hesitation, of course. Then we have have, you know, some of the dressings. I love starting with some oils and then adding the citrus juices, some herbs, and then you have some wonderful dressings. And then, you know, it's creating your own spices blends. So I created my own adobo blend with, you know, cumin, salt, pepper, lots of garlic powder, and you can create some wonderful rubs and spices for your cooking. But again, it's, you know, flavoring the foods and making those fruits and vegetables be the center of our food, no matter what we're doing. Like with a piece of meat here, a piece of pork, you know, you season the pork with some herbs and spices, and then you even add more, cook it with more vegetables, onions, and the citrus. And that's to give you an idea, kind of like, you know, what I'm talking about, how we can add more of these flavors to decrease the salt, the fat, and the sugar into our cooking. And even olives, you know, add such a wonderful, robust flavors. But, you know, with tomatoes, this could be really, I use a lot of these fruits, salsas for seafood and other meat entrees as well. But they really, is a way to season them and to really infuse the flavor into the other dishes that we love. And then, you know, no way, you know, it's not that we don't want to get them to eat tortillas, but we can get variety. And maybe some days we can create these dishes with wraps or burritos with lettuce wraps or cabbage wraps or things like that, that we see even in other countries. But again, a nopalito salad could be, you know, really healthy while adding a few more other vegetables. But, you know, we got to go beyond the tomatoes and the lettuce that we're so, you know, engraved in our heads. Desserts and juices, you know, can really become a way also to infuse more fruits and vegetables. And this is a great thing for like picky eaters. We can create things like, you know, things like popsicles, paletas, as we call them in Mexico, or the juices that you can infuse a lot of vegetables into them, or cereals. Love infusing any nutrients that we can into a bowl of cereal. Could have fruits and nuts and seeds. A hot chocolate or coffee, you know, with milk, could also become even more nutritious when we combine different food groups into those meals. Again, you know, we have to make sure that we understand that the fruits and vegetables is really where we get the most of our nutrients, and their plate needs to be loaded with that, and then a quarter of the other. It's always how I present this. But we have to, you know, we see the rice and beans, something extremely healthy, but then, you know, where are the vegetables? So we have to really make room for the others. I say, you know, poquito porque es bendito, you know, so we have to go little in some of these things that we love, you know, just decrease it a little bit, not to take them off, but decrease them to a way to make room for the other food groups that we also need in our plate. And I want to tell you just a little bit about preparation methods, because I think this is really critical in our culture. We love to fry everything. And I've been experimenting this past year with an air fry. I have nothing to do with them, but I am obsessed about it because, you know, you can make plantains, empanadas, you name it, sorullos, alcapurrias, all the things that we know we really fried all the time. We can actually make them with not even a drop of oil. Nothing wrong with oil, but, you know, we can use it in other things for our, you know, for the salsas and for the dressings and those sauces that we love. But, you know, we can really save a lot of calories when we use different cooking methods such as this. And again, you still get the crunchiness and the flavors because you can season these foods very well. Again, the Guide to Healthy Eating, the Latin American Diet Pyramid from Oldways. I love it because, you know, as you can see, emphasizes what, you know, the foods that really have a lot of high dense nutrients and the things that we need to eat the most. So I love referring to this table anytime I can. But in summary, just wanted to really emphasize that the women still own the kitchen. You know, we spend a lot of money on food purchases, not sometimes necessarily thinking about nutrients, but thinking about what the family loves. But we have to understand that our diets are really healthy and have a great base of fruits, vegetables, and grains and beans. And we just have to, you know, make sure that we help them to really season them, to make great salsas, to make these, help them to fall in love with the things that are more nutrient dense. So with that, I want to let you know that, you know, regardless of, you know, the age and the country of origin, you know, these Hispanics are really retaining their culture, and we need to really respect that and help them to make the best of it. But I love to stay in touch with all of you. I can send you recipes, whatever you need. Here's my information. You can follow me on Twitter and Facebook. I post a lot of recipes, and I really thank you for your time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. as the other three, full of information, just really wonderful. And we do have a few questions, and people are staying with us, so I'd like to ask the questions. Constance, can you unmute yourself? Can you speak more about African Americans and their distrust in the medical field? How can that attitude change?
It's a process, as with any behavior change, you know, think of it that way. But just trying to use examples of people that have gone to the doctor, have taken medication successfully. Of course, we always want to emphasize prevention more so than needing medication, but looking at it from, you know, if we think of motivational interviewing, that's great to help individuals to see how they can benefit from taking the medication, or how they can benefit from changing their behavior. Oftentimes they, like any other culture, they want to see their children, their grandchildren grow up, get married, and so on. So using those as motivators to help them to change their, you know, to go to the doctor, to follow the recommendations. And it's not always easy. It's definitely not easy. And that, a lot of that depends on how old the individual is, whether they have just heard about it from you know, reading about the Tuskegee experiment and so on, or if it's something, if they actually have relatives that they can, you know, reach out to that have shared the story with them. But it's not easy. It's definitely not easy.
Thank you. One more for you, Constance. There were questions about the study that you mentioned about leaving traditional diets. Would it be possible for you to send me the link to that or the reference to that study, and we can send it to all the people who are part of the webinar? Yes,
I'll do that now. I put a couple of links in from other questions. I think I missed that question. Okay, I'll do that right now. Put it in the chat.
Great. There are questions of whether the slides will be available. Yes. Next week, the slides will be on the Oldways website, and if you're looking for continuing ed credits, you will receive those next week as well. Sylvia, I sometimes hear Latino patients say they drink natural juices. Is this something particular to the Latino community?
Yes, they love to, when it comes to natural, you know, they love that word. So I use natural in, you know, in as best as I can, but these natural juices means that, you know, they're having those aguas frescas. So it's basically water and some pulp of the juice, but also a lot of sugar. So we have to ask more questions to really dig in, because a lot of these natural juices, they add a lot of sugar to them. And I remember even telling some of my patients, telling them, why don't we try it just with the juice and a little, you know, dilute it with some of the water, but don't add the sugar, and see how that goes. And they are actually a little hesitant, but when they try, they're like, wow, this is actually pretty good. It doesn't really need sugar. So it's just a habit to add the sugar to a lot of these beverages. But I love to infuse them with mint and lots of, you know, lemon juice or any of the basil and herbs like that really add a lot of flavor. And I make a big pot at morning, and then that flavors get more into the water. So trying to help them to get, you know, the taste of something without adding a lot of, you know, calories.
That's great. Thank you. And there's a question about any chance of some of these recipes being posted. I know that the Oldways website is, we have so many recipes, so please go to oldwayspt.org, and all of the sites that were mentioned by Sylvia, Karen, and Constance, you'll be able to see the slides and see those websites. There are so many great recipes. And I know that there were questions about how to learn more about a taste of African heritage or a taste of Latin American heritage, how to become a teacher. There's another Sarah at Oldways, Sarah Anderson with an H, and that you can email her. It's sanderson@oldwayspt.org. If you're interested in teaching, she'll be very happy to help you. And I think that's all of the questions. I can't thank the three of you enough. Each and every presentation was fascinating, interesting, inspiring, and incredibly helpful for practitioners. So a big round of applause to all three of you. Thank you to all of you who have been listening. It's great to see all the everyone staying throughout this, and thank you very much. And
I have the link, but I don't see the question.
there was one more question.
No, I have the link for the article, or at least the citation for the article.
If you send it to me by email,
Okay.
I can send it to all the attendees.
Okay, great.
Thank you. Have a great rest of your day, wonderful weekend. Be well, be safe.
Thank you.